that was an exciting tour through some San Francisco and California and Nevada history. I am going to give a presentation that will work at 3 different levels: a really broad level, a not quite so broad level, and a nice local level. But just an opportunity to present to a wider audience something that I was able to present in more detail to the academic meeting earlier today. Look at work by historians to try to tell a story at the level of the whole world as well as that of national history and local history. So that's the first part of this big data in history. Then I'll look at global silver production to 1900, and then at the Comstock load and Stockton. So I'll try to not get carried away on this one, but the point that I want to make is that in the present day, as we're thinking of a lot of major issues, I won't necessarily call them all crises at the global level, questions of environment, questions of social inequality, questions of political, of governance, I'll put it that way. We are making big plans for the future, and we're conscious that it's a future for the planet as a whole, not just region by region. The fact is we're very short on facts about the task of humanity as a whole. So we have histories of local regions, but we're not sure how to add them all up. So the project that I lead is one aimed at trying to create a global historical data set. So these are some of the collaborators that I work with in an organization that's called the Collaborative for Historical Information and Analysis. It's based at the University of Pittsburgh, where I work, but it includes people at a variety of universities, especially in the US, but also in Europe, and with connections in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So our work includes, on the one hand, thinking about a big question, and the big question that we've chosen to focus on is socio-economic inequality, which can be phrased in terms of economics, who's rich and who's poor, but also in terms of social hierarchy, who's ranked well and who's ranked poorly, and in question of health and environmental conditions. There's a lot of ways in which different individuals and groups are unequal. And while we look at it in terms of contemporary debate and crisis, we can also ask the question, how has inequality changed over time? And that's the research that we're trying to do, try to look at patterns all over the world and for the last several centuries, and see what has been the experience of inequality. That's the analytical part of it. Then the other part is the one that we call big data, which is the idea of actually collecting information on the lives of people around the world for the last several hundred years. In some countries, they're really well documented. So the US is well furnished with good documents going back at least 300 years. So in some European countries, Sweden stands out, have extraordinarily good records. Other places, so countries and regions in Africa on which I've worked particularly, it's a lot harder to come up with evidence about times a long while ago. And so it takes more imagination to document them. In any case, our work is to combine, on the one hand, the task of figuring out how to do the documentation, and on the other hand, how to analyze the records once we get them. So this slide, especially the first half of it, shows a restatement of what I said before. Really, the bottom half of it are some of the particular difficulties that we run into in trying to create a world historical data resource. One is that of documentation. It involves taking a wide range of historical records. Historical records written in multiple languages, but with multiple topics, and defined in complex and different ways. It's valuable resources, but there's an immense amount of work of collecting, organizing, systematizing, and documenting there's the first part of it, and we've chosen, the reason it says World Historical Gazetteer there, is we've chosen to give a particular attention to describing places. We have come up with a systematic way of talking about places around the world so that we can compare the documents from different areas in their references to place. And then the next level down is different ways in which we're organizing the data. So we have lots of data. For instance, it could be a census of Stockton in 1890, or it could be the tax records of the state of California. There are always documents of these different sorts that one puts into tables, into tabular data sets. And the problem is that these different data sets are all separate from one another. Each one is intelligible by itself, but it's not it's not clear how to add together the census of Stockton in 1890 and California State's financial or economic records. And yet it would be necessary if we're going to get a picture of the world as a whole to combine them. So that's one task, is working on how to link tabular data sets to one another. Another task addresses the question that there are, if we're trying to document the world as a whole, there's so much data that are missing. There was the amounts of trade, if we go back a little bit before the silver and gold trade in the United States and think of beaver trade in earlier times, a huge trade back and forth across North America, but which is not really documented. And we would like to know what the quantities were, but we have to use some imagination to fit them together. So figuring out the actual past of humanity with regard to inequality or other issues involves not simply just coding up all of the data that are written down, but trying to guess intelligently at the levels of activity where we don't actually have written documents. And then down at the bottom is the idea of a master conceptual table. We will hope to gather enough information from different directions in actual documents or in the estimations that we make to get a picture of human social change over the last few centuries. So then this is a picture of the various elements of the project. It's got a place up top where one submits and adds in the data, and then it's got a place where one tries to document the data, a place below that where one tries to link the little data sets into larger data sets, and then another section or so for analyzing. These are the logical sections of the overall analysis. This is a picture of the work that we have to go through in documenting individual data sets. Each one, we have about 20 questions we ask on each document to try to make it so they're comparably defined. And then at a higher level, this one didn't work out, so we're just going to add something more complicated, and that one was more than the computer could handle. Then for the initial data as we collect it, we can do basic analysis at the level of these separate little data sets, lots of them, and then where are we? Yep. And then after collecting our small data sets, we try to assemble them into larger data sets. So that's another look at that. And it mentions the Pittsburgh supercomputing center with which we work. And then here's the idea of linking the data sets. All I just said is, well, there's a bunch of complicated things that we do to try to do that. And here's an idea of trying to fill in the blanks and estimate the missing data along with the existing historical data. And this is an adventurous new mathematical technique. We have just submitted a grant proposal and see if we can fund it to work on this. Filling in the blanks on a large scale. I went the wrong way, don't do that. Finally, there's analysis where we're hoping to combine the work of scholars in multiple fields, not to separate the economists from the psychologists, but to have all finding ways in which to collaborate with one another and to provide insights into large-scale planetary phenomena and inequality and in other issues. So that's my quick look at the idea of a world historical data resource. Meanwhile, my group is collecting data in various areas, and we've been working especially with Dennis here at University of Pacific, and also with Georges de Peru, who leads in France and Belgium, a massive project for collecting data on monies around the world. We're especially interested in silver. Silver is jewelry, but silver is especially money. It's the best single indication there is of how much money has been circulating around the world for some time. If we could document how much silver we have had at various times and how silver has moved from one place to another, that's the best sort of one variable interpretation of the evolving economy of the world that we can come up with. It would start us on the way of a larger project of understanding the global economy. Here are, let's see, here based on the resources that we've been able to use in the last year is a picture of a set of estimates, the best estimates we have so far, of the amount of silver produced year by year from 1403 up to 1880 about. And this is in terms of ounces. So it gets up just over 100 million ounces produced at the end of the 1870s. And you see that the amount of silver produced grew steadily. So more and more work, but also more and more of an active global economy interested in absorbing that. And then what we did is we said, well, if you take last year's silver and add it to this year's silver, and then add it to the next year's silver, you get the total accumulation of silver that's circulating. All right, so we began by assuming that there was no silver in 1403. That's not true. There was already silver circulating. But if we begin with that and add up each year the amount of silver, then we get what is the top line on this graph, going up to 10 trillion, close to 10 trillion ounces of silver as of 1890. But of course, not all the silver stays. It gets worn out. People cut off bits and pieces of it, it gets lost. So we made various estimates. What happened if you lose 1% of the silver a year, or if you lose 2% of the silver a year, and so forth. And so this gives other indications. So you see this total amount of silver flowing around the world, growing steadily, but we have different estimates of it. So it's exciting to have those first looks at it. Now here's a look at the shorter period of time that we've worked on especially. So from 1870 to 1900. Now this overlaps the Comstock period a little bit, right? So the Comstock load 1859 to about 1874 is when it was really putting out lots of, and this graph starts at 1870 and goes up to 74. So the bottom line on this is the production of silver in the United States. You see that it grows steadily, and it's really very large. And then the next line above it, so the Mexican part is stacked on top of the American part. You see that Mexico produced substantial but smaller amounts of silver than the U.S. up until about, 1885. And then after that, Mexican silver continued to grow to the point where it was probably larger in total than U.S. silver production. And those were the two biggest silver producers in the world. And then on top of that is a little bit that's produced in Germany up to the green level, and then all the way up to all other. Those are all the other countries around the world and the amount of silver that was produced in them. The U.S. was a major silver trader, was buying and selling silver, and so the red line shows there how much silver came into the United States. Where did it come from? A bunch of different places, but especially Mexico. And then the amount of silver that went out of the United States, and that's the total there. Clearly more going out than came in because the U.S. is a major silver producer. And then this is the difference between the two, okay? The net exports, the amount of exports minus the imports. And you see the U.S. was always exporting, and in some years really a lot, and other years not. So that's about the business cycle and things like that. It's an interesting set of facts to pursue. And then Oh, now we're getting into kind of too much detail, but these records give us special attention to England, France, and Germany. And you can see that silver, the top level, the blue level, is all the silver that was sent out of the U.S. Most of the silver that was sent out of the U.S. went to England. And then the English sent it all around the world. And then much smaller amounts went to France and Germany. That's what this one shows. And then all the others, the ones that were left out, exports to up to $20 million. Well, we don't know what all the other countries are yet. And then this is imports, silver that came into the United States. And we have amounts that came in from England and France and Germany, but very little is produced in France and Germany. So we go to the next graph, and we say this is the silver that came into the U.S. from all other countries, but that's mostly Mexico. So those are examples of some of the things that we could find in our studies of silver, and we're looking forward to digging into more. So with that, I'll go to the third part of my talk, which is a look at the Comstock lode. Now, I'm a world historian. I'm not a historian of Nevada or California. I like my job is to keep track of large-scale issues and their interactions. But I grew up in California. I'm interested in this stuff, and I took this opportunity to take a quick look at the history of the Comstock lode and see what I came up. Now, so you're contrasting me, the Johnny-come-lately, to this issue, to the work that Jordy Lynch has given you, where he's been studying this issue long and hard, and where many others present here know a lot about the issue. But here's my quick look. It's a reminder that I put Zacatecas there because between 1700 and 1850, the place in North America that produced the most silver was the province of Zacatecas in northern Mexico. That's where the mines were, that's where the miners were. And then suddenly, the Comstock lode emerges in 1859. And it is a particular sort of ultimately a very tangible, easily recognizable form of blue-grade sandy quartz, which is a sulfide of silver. And we'll get a look at it in just a moment. And then in this period from 1859 to 74, they've identified 6 different bonanzas where it exploded in one area and another, and then the workings got worked out. And early miners came from places where people knew about mining or were just ready to work. So especially a lot of Mexican miners, some Chilean miners, and miners from China were very active in the Comstock lode. And then they tended to get moved out in a hurry and forgotten about. But especially those from Mexico had important technical knowledge and left some of the major innovations. One other important thing is that the work of taking this silver sulfide and turning it into just plain silver required mercury, so somehow large amounts of mercury had to be brought into the region. And don't forget, there was no railroad at this time. No railroad didn't show up until 1869 in Nevada. And so this was mule trains going over the Sierras in the days of the Donner Party. You could only go at certain times of the year. In the early processing, they lost huge amounts of the silver just through inadequate knowledge of what work to do. And the levels of accidents and so forth were probably always high, but especially in the early days. But relatively rapidly, it becomes a high-tech, big capital industry. And what's striking to me is just the amount of technological change that happens in the big work. This is before electric power, it's steam power, and compressed air, and interesting things. But one thing is that the spaces that were dug out were huge, not just small little tunnels, but huge areas, and so cave-ins were very common. So one very important development was a system of what they called square, but what are really cubic timbers, in order to hold up the roof as you were digging further down. And we'll have an illustration of that. Another interesting thing was that the work in Virginia City required huge amounts of water for the purpose of amalgamation, water for just washing things and beyond. One of the early developments was an aqueduct that went from an area high in the Sierras, and then it was a huge pipe with basically a lead pipe that went down into the valley and then back up to Virginia City. There was a siphon that brought ultimately a huge amount of water into Virginia City and kept the mines going for some time. This is a technique that was first developed in Roman aqueducts. Well, they dug them through hard stone to do this. In any case, but it was a major innovation. There were steam pumps and hydraulic pumps to move the water from the mines, because the mines were incredibly wet. Sometimes they were cold and wet, but particularly the water down was very often hot, and so you could get scalded in there, and they had to get that water out of there. They had to get air into the tunnels where people are down there, so they use compressed air and pipes to send the air in order to get fresh air to where the workers are. They use diamond drills to cut stone. The Sutro Tunnel is a fascinating thing. These mines are huge, but there's all this water in the bottom. The Sutro Tunnel was the idea of a big tunnel that was dug underneath the Comstock lode in order to make it possible to drain water out of all of the mines. And ultimately it was very effective. On the other hand, it didn't get there until 1863 or 4, so most of the way through the whole period of it. So the word Sutro is a term known well in San Francisco. Let's see, what have I got now? And then one other thing I've left out of this is the danger of all the different ways you can lose your life, from cave-ins to fires to the baskets that you're moving up and down and breaking because of the wires, to falling into scalding hot water. There were just a lot of really serious problems. Okay, a few pictures. This is my picture of these square but really cubic frames that were put in as they dug up all these huge areas to prop up the top and be able to dig down below. And so that's one effective innovation that came from the Comstock mines. Here's a look at a mule train. This is in Virginia City. It's at the beginning of the Sutro Tunnel. And here's a look at the Bonanza ore. Okay, this is it. This is that, especially that dark part over there. That part with the silver in it. Right. That was my quick look at Comstock mine. And now let's ask about Stockton. So, looking rapidly through histories of Stockton in this era, what I find is lots of attention to the gold rush era. So Stockton founded in 1849, just after the gold rush starts, and benefiting from that, Stockton really, directly opposite to the foothills where all the placer mining took place. Stockton as a supply point for the gold rush. Stockton as a railroad head, but not yet. The railroad didn't come for some time. So here's a nice early image of the town as it was laid out. Very shortly after it finishes. This is a watercolor done in 1849 of the central area, including a bit of the port. What happened? Something happened. Missed one. Okay. This is Jones and Hewlett. This is 1860s. You can see the wagons and all of the equipment that were out on the streets. Here's Maine and El Dorado. It says 1800s. It's a little vague. They're not sure where it is, but again, a nice mule train. The slide that didn't show up is the Weber. I was saying that something went wrong, so I got one or two more under Street, and then by the 1890s, things are looking clean up a little bit. The Comstock lode and its aftermath are gone, and agriculture is developing, a whole separate story. The railroad story, I'll just put this in at the end. The interest in building a railroad grew as all of the silver was coming out of the Comstock lode, but it took them until 1859, 1862, the national government says, yes, we're going to build a transcontinental railroad. Nothing much happens until about 1866. And even then the concern is, well, maybe it won't be possible to build the road up the Sierra Mountains. Those mountains are really, we just drive up the freeway nowadays. But if you want to walk that, especially if you want to walk it in in winter, it's different. And so they were afraid about building. But ultimately between 1866 and 69, the railroad was put all the way to Reno, and then with another small railroad line over to Virginia City. And from that point, the silver could come down the hill and to Oakland, ultimately. And where was the main stop along the way? Well, it ended up being Sacramento rather than Stockton. It could have been one or the other. But out of this has made me really interested in the railroad history of California in the 1860s and 70s. See where Stockton and Sacramento fit in at that point. Okay, there's my quick look. Thanks for the chance to present it to you. On monetary history and silver can do to fit into historical studies more broadly. I am, what I think I should do, because we'll want to be short on time, is race rather rapidly through my 30 slides, and really quite rapidly, and then see where you would like to go from there. But my work for the last most of 10 years has focused on this notion, on the notion that here we are with a bunch of global problems, and we don't have any global data with which to do it. I mean, we have summaries of local data, but we don't have data that in an integrated way gives you picture of things about human society overall, and then for the subsections of human society and how the local interacts with the global. We do rather well on that with regard to climate nowadays, but not with regard to human society. And it's a big task to start that work out. And so we're working on various pieces of it. This second slide is just the argument that while taking social science and trying to do it really at a global level sounds completely outrageous considering the small scale work that social scientists do, there are other big projects in science and knowledge that have been done and carried off. Collaboration of people working in various disciplines at the University of Pittsburgh, but also working with people at other institutions that are listed here. Most of these institutions have been associated on one National Science Foundation grant from 2013 to 2015 to try to build infrastructure for a global historical archive, hold global data, collect global data, but also a place to try to assemble small-scale global tabular data sets into larger scale data sets. We made some progress. Here's a statement of objectives. I'll just go to the next version of this slide right away, which is to say that we're on one hand, we're working on data collection, and on the other hand, we're really interested in getting to the level of analysis and theory. So I would say I was so entranced myself with the idea that we just need some kind of a big archive that tells us what's going on at a global level. But these projects never go ahead unless there's some particular issue that's motivating the work. And the particular issue we decided, and a lot of other people decided, is inequality in human society. And so we're trying to balance the technological side of things with the theoretical and analytical side at once. With regard to inequality, the decision that we made being historians working on this rather than economics is that inequality is not just economic inequality, and it's not just economic causes of economic inequality, but there's a bunch of other things going on here. Especially there are social distinctions that are made, but there are also differences in people's biological constitution or in the environment or the way in which people respond to the environment. So, and what we're talking about is trying to find some way to consider all of these at once, which means considering how to link up some very different types of data organized in different ways. So that's a big project. And then this over here is a picture of the structure that we have designed to analyze and document this material. Here's the same, top half of this is the same thing as before. I'll just say that the categories in which we've designed our work now are to say, on the one hand, we think of the big questions, and so that's the inequality. And then on the other hand, working with big data, that is the idea that there ought to be a global accounting of the past. And I've increasingly come to say that the idea of a national census or national income accounts give you an idea of what a global accounting would be. It's just raised up a level on order of magnitude. But the particular issues that we're working on are especially the documentation of data sets. So this is just a technology we've run into that just held us up for 2-3 years, being able to describe historical data sets in a sufficiently consistent way that they could be put end to end and stuck together to add up to something. That's a big problem. And we've worked especially in spatial designation of World Historical Gazetteer as a particular part of that we're trying to get hold of. And then for our strategies for assembling the data, we've been following two, one after another, and then we realized we'll be stuck with both. One of which is the idea of assembling all of these tabular data sets. So if you have, social scientists work with SPSS and SAS data sets and this kind of thing, each one has all the data defined within them and no way to link it to the next data set. And there are just thousands, millions of these data sets lying separately, discrete, not hardly in touch. And then people have to do a whole bunch of work to add them up. So we're trying to figure out ways algorithms that will help us to assemble data sets into larger units. But the other approach that we're taking is to leap over that problem and use some new mathematical techniques that are being developed, in which we would get all the data we can get, put it into a big matrix on this is inequality for the planet, and hand it to a supercomputer and give it some algorithms and say, okay, now try to calculate estimates of the missing data. And then it makes estimates of the missing data. Then you say, okay, well, let's throw away a lot of the missing data, or all the data that are there, and then see if you can use the algorithms that you use to recreate a whole data set. And then you go through this process iteratively. I have a slide later on that says all of these things. In any case, it's not going to work out the first time because the algorithms that we'll use to estimate missing value will be too simple. But we'll get more sophisticated at and maybe make some progress in that way. So the master conceptual table is the idea of a comprehensive data set with not all the things we need to know, but an awful lot of information, historical different information, some of it actually from documents, and some of it simulation finishing in fill in blank spaces. My principal research for, I guess, most of my career has been trying to figure out population size and structure in the African continent in the days before censuses. Okay, so to me, the idea of simulating, filling in guesses at length is perfectly logical, indeed necessary process. Okay. So here's the point. Now we can look at this a little bit better. There's a dimension of the project which is submitting data. So we have the data hoover for sweeping up data. We have a big section on documentation, and then we have to put the data in an archive where people can see it. So we have a public archive of our data, and then we have other data that we can put into that public archive. Yeah? And then with what the initially documented data, you can do a bunch of basic analysis. But then we go to the process of linking, either by linking data sets one by one, or by simulating the missing data. Once you've got, in that case, data that are aggregated enough, large enough in quantity, then you could try a larger scale of analysis and try to ask big, broad questions, in particular about the nature of human inequality. Has it grown or shrunk? Different parts of the world at different times. These are questions we would be able to address in that case. Okay, so then real quick looks at these particular areas. We have a level 1 of documentation. This is just 30 different questions of which I can show a few here that we ask for each question, each data file, to try to have them documented systematically in terms of the variables and the dimensions, but also in terms of the provenance. If we have a big data set and we decide we want to change price indices or something like that, we would have to make changes throughout it. We'd have to know all the previous changes that we made in order to calculate the next set of changes. That's why you need this really detailed documentation of your data. And then there's a level 2 of documentation where this is the level at which we try to develop, well, here's a case of our World Historical Gazetteer, the idea of a resource that describes a whole bunch of world historical places in a consistent fashion, and then is linked to localized gazetteers that dig more deeply down into particular localities or particular topics. So for instance, we're working with a group that works on history of slavery and free people of color in the Americas in the colonial period. Okay, and so they have their spatial information that they would make as a set of geographical data would be collected in this larger spine, as we call it. All of that is documentation. Then we have archives where we store this stuff, and we realize it's not going to be stored in one place, but they'll be distributed archives shared amongst a bunch of different institutions. We have to administer that and keep track of what's where. And there's an example. This is from our public archive, a listing, an initial listing of what's in there, the beginnings of such a listing. Okay, now back just to look at the overall structure. So then we do, as I say, some basic analysis. One interesting project that we're working on is that Sudarsh Chandra at Michigan State University has figured out some techniques for analyzing censuses, beginning in British India and then working on Ceylon and Indonesia, to estimate how many people lost their lives in the course of the 1918 flu epidemic. He goes a couple of censuses after and a couple of censuses before, and goes region by region and makes his guess. And so we have the project of doing this for more countries around the world. If we could do it for enough countries around the world, you would have a picture that we do not have yet of the pace of this epidemic that started wherever it started, in New Jersey or someplace else, that spread around the world and was gone within a year, and then had carried off, at least 50 million people. But where we've stuck with the local dynamics rather than the global dynamic. We have the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center in town, and that helps us work on large scale work. This is more on linking tabular data sets. So this is an overly complex view of just the different elements of trying to work on coming up with algorithms that enable us to take different data sets and find what's common amongst them and link them together. And then this is a look at the idea of simulating and verifying missing data. And as I say, we start with a bunch of basic data, we simulate more data, we sparsify, get rid of a bunch of stuff, reconstitute, and then go over that again and again. Ideally, it would work out that you would have an internally consistent set of relations amongst data, both historical data and simulated data, and that would be something that you could analyze. And then this is just another too complicated example of the steps involved in what I've just described. The type of analysis that we hope to do would require bringing people from a bunch of different social sciences and natural sciences, health sciences, environmental sciences, together with their theories to help us decide how the simulations and linkages should be proposed for the creation of data and also what sort of statements we would propose as hypotheses for the analysis of this big data set that would be created out of this, and then focusing especially on questions of inequality. Though if this whole apparatus were to do a reasonable job in understanding inequality, you could put it together, put it to work on other historical problems as well. And there it is. Now that's just one slide with a bunch of things, including a look at my little book on big data in history. I finally brought a copy of it, along with it came out in 2013. A lot of things have changed since then, but it's still an outline of the dream of a big data set and with collaborative work to keep it going. There. Now, so that's what one could ask. For one, what's the relationship to a conference on numismatics, and what's the relationship to a conference on that where we just heard a story of a very historical and analytical, and at the same time chemical story of silver production. But I'm not presenting here. I'll say a little bit later on today about the work that we've done in trying to assemble from the work that George and colleagues have done to collect huge amounts of data on silver production and exchange. That if we could come up with a good interpretation of how much silver was produced and where it moved over the course of the last 500 years, that would be the closest thing that we have by far to an interpretation of the functioning of the world economy. And the thing is, because silver is so tangible and so interesting to people, and as many imponderables as there are, we really know a lot about it. It's within reach. So that's, though I've already heard a bunch of things here today that made me question things I thought I knew, but that's the way this process. So this, what I've just presented can be seen as an example of what a broader user of the materials that you're working on will do with it. But in the expectation of lots of feedback, I just think that the potential to have publications that are using silver production, silver flows, and of course the role of silver in monetary exchange as a measured introduction to the society and the economy of the world. It's easy to say 500 years because the story goes on before that, but there's a kind of a comparable way in which it's been documented, or not quite documented for that last 5 centuries. Well, we could stop at this point, or if you can think of things that you would like to do on this space, we'd be happy to go off in any direction at all. Yeah.
So I think over lunch you said that, so now you are studying 19th century silver production, right? Now, have you already gone back to the 18th, 17th, 16th century, or are you starting with 19th century and going backwards?
So the volumes that we have to work with, I've got them over there across the room, 3 nice big volumes published just a year ago by Moneta, really concentrate on gold and silver data from 1870 to 1900. And one thing is, there was just a tremendous amount of interest in that time in publishing data. That's why it's such a great place to start. On the other hand, the same volumes go all the way back to 1403, and I could call up an image to show that sort of stuff if you don't mind me fiddling around on it. Wait a minute, I've got a different computer, so I won't be able to do that. I will show later tonight, or I can show. In any case, the basic pattern is a steady growth in annual production of silver from the 17th or the 16th century right up to the end of the 19th century, with periods of greater or lesser growth, but it grows steadily. And especially if you think of cumulative growth, that is the size of the money supply, the amount of silver, total amount of silver circulation, it grows really quite substantially. And you also see though, that so much silver was produced in the mid and late 19th century that of the silver that was circulating in, say, 1900, the great majority of that had been brought into play, had been marketed since 1870 or 1860. So we did various calculations of that, of what the loss of, assuming that all of the silver is becoming money, that's not a correct assumption, and then assuming a loss of 0.5% or 1% a year or 2% a year, and it came up with totals on that. In any case, it's kind of nice. It's a statement that probably the total amount of money in silver was not the only money, but it was the biggest single section of money supply in all this time. That there was a healthy rate of growth of the global economy for that whole period of the last 5 centuries. I'm trying to do the 20th century stuff, I suppose it's going to be the same time.
Professor, may I ask you to kind of zoom out a little bit and get back to the sort of big questions, existential questions. Is there a real danger that progression of supercomputers and so on, you're going to paint a picture of what you think the past is, and that it might be in 50 years from time that we'll have to argue against the model. We'll have to, your team will, like people are probably not aware of, like the IBM Newton computer and so on, just how efficient it is at taking information and using it. But it's a real danger that what you produce, and this won't be in your lifetime perhaps, but it will say this is what world history looked like, and this is what we think happens. And anyone who is in the field will have to kind of contradict that, to say, well, and they'll always be marginalised. They'll always be a local person. They'll always, well, he's a small historian, he can't see the big picture, and his small picture stuff just doesn't fit into the big picture. That big stuff has got to be able to translate and work at a local level, just as our local histories have to fit into much larger frameworks. How do you propose to do that?
Well, first, sure, of course there is such a danger. We've seen scientific work of every sort go off on a wrong
Economic
direction.
history has disappeared in Australia because econometrics tells us what the history was, so you don't need
Yeah, so it's a sad story, right? I mean, it happened a little slower in Australia and Britain and in other places. There were economic history departments. They hung on for a while. They got swallowed up in economics departments. And on the other hand, I went to the Economic History Congress in Kyoto last year. It was the most terrific meeting. There's the most wonderful work going on that is mostly not going to be thrown away. But another way to look at that is to say, let's look back at history and see what interpretations of the world have been and how earlier interpretations of the world have held out. Okay, so early interpretations of the world that got into the literature were heavily Eurocentric, were entirely biased towards what was going on in the mind of the monarch, sort of stuff, okay? And for all that, not totally wrong. There are things one can retrieve from that history, but there are corrective pressures in history. But as a matter of principle, what do you mean world history does not mean just doing the top level. So an essential part of the work is looking at all the levels, right? So that's why I say that in the model that we're creating, each cell is supposed to have documentation on that cell. Where did we get that information? What transformations has that been put through, so that we are able through that to look hopefully at the implications of small scale patterns on the larger scale and the other way around, assuming that both exist. I think it'll be a nice adventure, and I just think, but I do think that as serious as that sort of problem is, where we are now is with all the wonderful advances in knowledge going on, the fact that we have manifest global problems, the ecological crisis that we face and the crisis that we face in human inequality and the likely social conflict that comes up, not to be collecting data on it seems a mistake. Thank you for the opportunity. But yeah.
Really enjoyed your talk. Sounds very exciting. I've used tables and tables and tables of data in Chinese publications from the late 20th century, and I've often hoped that somebody would pull them all together, because typically those are organized in these sources by counties. But here's my question. You just use the term models, and one of the goals of social science analysis, I think, is the use of models for forecasting, right? And my sense is that what you're doing here is really not about forecasting, right? Or maybe it is. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the model and if it's for forecasting.
Well, simple way out of that is to say it's forecasting the past. So we are modeling it. And so my effort to explain what was going on in African population over the last few centuries, did the loss of all of those people to enslavement cause a decline in the remaining population on the African continent? I'm now really sure that yes, the answer is in region after region the population was reduced, and we can break that down to issues about the lives of individuals, the life course, balances of male and female population. On the other hand, the grant proposal we just submitted to NSF is called Social Weather Service. Now this is my colleague Vladimir Zadarowski, who's in information science, and the two of us have been working together in detail for years. And one of the good things about this is that this is not work farmed out between historians over here and information scientists over. We have worked together, and we learned a lot from each other. And this is his. So I don't really agree with all his ideas about social sciences, but I really agree with him a lot more than I did before. All right. So he's making his argument, though, is that we're going to analyze this, do this fancy simulate, sparsify, reconstitute stuff in order to be able to identify patterns in the past that show high correlations with social disturbance in one place or another. Okay, in that sense, we would have. This is why he calls it the weather service. Okay, we'd have certain situations that would project social unrest. Okay, so problem with that for me is, well, that sounds like that we're taking the standpoint of whoever's in charge to make sure that everybody else stays quiet. All right. On the other hand, I still think that understanding about those correlations is important, so I'm going along with this version for now. So these are moral dilemmas as well as academic dilemmas. And wish you a lot of luck on gathering all that material together. Yes.
I was just thinking about some Swiss city treasurer books with all these numbers you might use for big data in one day, but it's always such a problem to interpret different data because they are referring to different sizes. You don't know exactly which size. They are switching sizes at a certain point that you can't see why and where. How do you make sure that the data you are using for your project are on the same quality?
I would say that we have not got either our system of data definition clear enough, nor do we have a large enough stream of data coming in to be able to say have practical statements about that. But you can see with the problem, I mean, those records are obviously incredibly useful, but they're
but we can't interpret it and compare that because we don't have the same, we can't even say is the barrel of salt in that city exactly the same barrel of salt in that city.
Well, one thing is that all of this work needs to put error margins on any number that we come up with, right? Because there's going to be tolerances, and we have some idea, and there's this real tendency in the social science literature just to put the number there and be done with it. And we do need to systematically develop systems of judgment because on the question of the variation amongst the barrel sizes, one could actually do research on that, right? And it's painful and slow, but one could have an idea of how big they are. You do this all the time with variations in exchange rates, right? And you can come up with, say, how big variations in exchange rates are in one currency or another and so forth. Where it can be done, it's incredibly laborious. So there's a huge difference. This is the problem with using the term big data, because big data is used nowadays for data that were created electronically, right? Like tweets and things like, they collect all of this stuff that's produced in exactly the same way. It's got all its metadata. You just start analyzing from day one. You don't have to clean up the data, or maybe you do. But in any case, that is very different from our case, where the data are so heterogeneous. Each one comes out of a different historical situation. You're translating language, you're translating locality, and yet the argument, I think, is that that's human experience. It's actually worth the very heavy cost it would be of digging into that data and trying to link it up. Yes?
In some of these models, so I'm wondering how to latch on for concreteness sake to this question of population distribution in Africa. So you got, say you got some data and you can try to reconstruct some missing data. But what if you say had also anecdotal evidence about, say, migrations inside of Africa?
Mm-hmm.
Where in your modeling would you put this?
Okay, so this is point of real frustration, and I'm just at an early stage in this work after 25 years of working on it. The model, as it's written now, is a deductive model about birth rates and death rates and migration rates. Okay? It doesn't allow me to account for climate changes. I know about climate changes, but to put them in the model is beyond my capacities right now. Or famines, or wars that cause migrations. Okay, these are all relevant factors. What I can hope to do is finish up this piece of work and put it out with the hypothesis overall, and then let people, including me, once I'm wearing another hat, get to work on taking it apart and revising it and so forth. And that iterative process has the potential to clarify things a bit. With regard to the African data, the biggest problem is this one. For the early stages of the African slave trade, I assume that it's the external slave trade to the Americas that's really governing things, and then the people get enslaved in Africa as a consequence of that. So you go in and you wipe out a village, you sell them in and keep the women in slavery, okay? Not for the Atlantic. Slightly different story on slave trade going across the Indian Ocean or going across the Sahara. In those cases, it's mostly women that go, mostly men that stay. But by the time you get to the 19th century, in some cases the export trade is dying down, in other cases it's not, but the amount of enslavement within Africa grows up. Things change, and the nature of slavery in Africa is different. So whole slave villages start getting formed rather than women just being owned by some guy. And while I can use the volume of slave trade to estimate things to the degree that they're governed by overseas slave trade, I don't have anything other than just my best guesses, or else endless reading of these things that do need to be read to estimate the volume of enslavement within the African continent. On the other hand, at this point, I feel I would be criminal not to put estimates in there and do as the literature has done all along and pretend that that enslavement wasn't happening. In fact, it's leading to, so we're going to have at the American Historical Association meeting, there's a plug, a session on the second slavery worldwide, which points out that temporal relationships between this great expansion of enslavement in Cuba and Brazil in the 19th century, clearly tied to capitalist production up and down the Atlantic. Same time, within the African continent, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, so Thailand and Burma, for example, very considerable expansion of enslavement in the mid and late 19th century. And then that whole system pretty much gets closed down at the beginning. What is setting the timing for this worldwide? In the case, so we have no answers, but we have much better questions. Yes?
Just trying to get my head around issues around inequality in particular, and looking at the challenges currently in measuring inequality. And I've looked a little bit at this in Southern Africa, but you measured the informal economy, and you have to take account for the informal economy, which is a huge challenge, and measuring that in terms of a rural context versus an urban context. And then we were talking yesterday about issues like totally different value systems, where the jute bags that the gold is carried in is worth more than the gold itself. You know, the neighbors leave the gold behind. And I guess trying to capture how how can we come to terms with those kinds of challenges as we look at sort of the historical picture of inequality, where we have so many different, I guess, informal, for lack of a better word, societies and economies that aren't part of the system that we have this data set on.
But they're part of the system in the real world. They're in the world. They're interacting with each other. They're not isolated to that extreme degree. They're coming up in southern Africa with more and more archaeological connections with people in Botswana that are tied to trade union in Mozambique. How did that stuff make its way back and forth? So the first problem I see is making some attempt to document all the places in the world and all the times that we're trying to cover, okay? The error margins on big parts of the world are huge. And then having done that, you still can't escape the problem that you faced about different values, just different economic valuations, but all kinds of other values. I think that an approach to take to that would be to take your data and then try to organize it according to different assumptions about values, run it through one way or another. Because what we've had is a vision of inequality that the economists got to work on their stuff and on price and wage and all the things that are documented really well, and they've done a nice job with that, as if that system were it and totally separated from, they cannot include racial discrimination in their story, except as a dummy variable, okay? And yet the decisions to expand and then the decisions to try to contract racial discrimination are really important in all kinds of dimensions of inequality. So I think we'll have many stumbles on the way towards, I don't think we'll just be able to assemble a giant data set that'll obediently give us numbers, but that people will raise all of these questions about it. But I have found this thing here, when I first proposed this notion that we would look at inequality in all of those different ways, I was waiting to be trashed by economists who say, you can't do that. But in fact, they understand it can be done. They're not going to lead in trying to do it, but there's a common interest in exploring it at different levels. So these economic figures, these are interval variables, right? If we're looking at social variables, race, gender, those are nominal variables, a completely different statistics, and you can't just add them up together. So there's going to have to be some sophisticated system of balancing and calculating different things, even then without addressing basic issues of morality and philosophy. Ready to take a try at it? Yes?
Very interesting project, exciting in terms of scope and mission. I'm going to follow up on Tom's question about inequality and how exactly you're grasping it, because I'm still having a hard time getting a sense of what's not in this data. Does that make sense? What doesn't sort of constitute a relationship of inequality? And may simply be a matter of I can't quite read what's up there under the sort of categories that you have. But I was just wondering if you could, especially when we get into the social and the political, can you give us a sense of what would constitute social and political unequal relationships, what doesn't? So what data have you left out, chosen to leave out? And then can I just ask a related question, which is inequality of what? Inequality in populations, between populations, organizations, regions.
So of what is important. So there, even within the economists, there's inequality of income and inequality of wealth, and those lead you in quite different directions. So the places that we have started is first just to begin taking some later steps in the analysis. We've done, I guess you would say, what the economists have done, grabbed a bunch of their data, all right, on contemporary times, but trying really to look at all different parts of the world rather than just saying, no, we're going to look at industrialized countries or something like that. So that's one thing we're trying to do. And so, but that, the economists are working, they're working in height data, they're working in caloric intake data, okay, they're looking at environmental conditions, and so some of that data is in there. Another approach, and so I have a graduate student who's doing really well in working on this, and he came up with the idea that if you want to look at inequality over a long period of time, how about the Caribbean as a place of study? Okay, so the Caribbean has and has had great variations in levels of inequality. It's had dramatic changes in its history, ups and downs for different parts of the Caribbean. It's relatively well documented, English, Spanish, Dutch, French, Danish, American documents. You have to assemble them, so forth, have been collected on this place for a long period of time. The islands don't change shape much, so you've got units that you can work with, so forth. So there's a subset of data that one could try. Then you still have to do a lot of archival work and so forth. But the idea of having a sort of systematic view of a part of the world with a highly varied population for the last 4 or 5 centuries, in addition to Europe, balances, it's a step towards a broader global thing. So it's incremental. Those are some of the increments we're taking. Yes?
Do you choose the Caribbean islands as a control group?
Well, if I had observations on everything else, they could be a control group. But maybe they're the main story at one point. But tell me more what you're thinking.
Because you said, the surface is restricted because there are islands that growth is restricted. They are homogeneous in certain ways. So the results that you may acquire from these islands given that certain parameters are constant, can serve perhaps as a control group.
So
When you study something else, you can...
right, it won't give us an idea of the variance in the planet as a whole.
No.
Right, it won't, but it'll give us a different sort of variance than we would get from doing the equivalent European studies.
Yeah.
And it'll take us a long time before we can do the equivalent African studies. Though we could do the equivalent studies of South America with some hope, and some parts of East Asia we'd be able to do those. So I guess my response would be use everything as a control on everything else. Yeah, it's an interesting formulation.
But since the Caribbean islands are small and self-contained and stuff, well, you can maybe other areas you need to control for more variables. Yeah, maybe you have fewer variables to do faster.
Maybe, perhaps.
I don't know what kind of model.
Certainly, one of the attractions of the region is that it was really the center of the imperial system for the 17th and 18th century, so a lot of the big priorities and big choices were being acted out there. But I will go back and start counting variables in different types of snapshots. Shall we declare victory?
Is